to Varn Blog, and today I am talking to Professor Nicholas Kiersey, Professor of Political Science at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley.
Good evening.
Good evening. Today we're talking about a lot of things. It's going to be a little bit of socialism, a little bit of politics of Ireland, a little bit of Sinead O'Connor. And actually, I wanted to talk about Sinead O'Connor's recent death, seemingly putting the Emerald Isles politics back into the American consciousness, because it seems to me, and we were talking about this off air a little bit, that since the failure of Corbynism and the fact that there haven't been troubles in a decade, and capital T, we haven't given a shit about Ireland. So
yeah, it's an interesting point. Yeah.
And so with Sinead O'Connor dying, there was recently, kind of discussions about that again, and about I guess the other thing is, the politics of Northern Ireland with Shin Fain having some dominance parliamentarily, but
sure.
But these things are. I think the politics of contemporary Ireland are pretty removed from the U.S. consciousness.
That's an interesting sort of question implicit in that already, right? About why is what's going on in the U.S. left right now that it can't really focus on a sort of a more global left movement?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like we can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time a lot of the time. Or when we focus on the global left, it's like in these, and I guess maybe part of this is the nature of the U.S. state, so we must be somewhat forgiving, but it's on grand geopolitical strategy issues between multipolarity or unipolarity, and not actually on the content of what's going on in a lot of these countries. So I wanted to ask you, what is going on in contemporary Ireland right now?
I mean, it's a tricky one. First of all, I should explain for your viewers and listeners, while I am Irish born and raised, and I do still spend a good bit of time there. A couple of times a year I'm over, maybe sometimes more, depending on the circumstances. I've been living in the United States for about 23 years now. And so I've been, in a sense, more attuned to American politics than Irish politics. And academically, I do write about Irish politics, and have some pieces over the years focusing on various aspects of Irish culture, and specifically cultural receptions of political economy. So that's kind of my main thing, is I'm sort of interested in how Irish version of Dragon's Den, or what Americans call Shark Tank. I'm kind of interested in questions of how these shows and kind of cultural products represent the idea of economic virtue, for want of a better term. And I'm interested in them as a kind of a form of pedagogy for how Irish citizens are sort of expected to behave and respond to the idea of crisis in the economy, which has been endemic since 2008. So all that is a sort of a roundabout way of explaining to listeners and viewers how my initial kind of go-to intuition as I seek to respond to your question, what's going on in Ireland right now, is that the country is sort of going through a transitional period. I think when I first started to look at the Irish cultural scene in the years, especially between 2008 and 2014, there was already, I think, a major shift in consciousness going on, right, in the year of 2008, which I remember very well because it was the year my sister got married. Apart from other things, there was in that fall a sort of an ominous sense as the as Lehman Brothers collapsed, that maybe things were not looking good in the Irish economy as well. that year and over the next year and a half, 2 years, the government began to articulate to the people that there would have to be some serious belt tightening. And I suppose sort of my opening kind of fusillade here would be just simply to lay out the significance of the shift in consciousness that I'm talking about, because in that 2008 to 2010, 2011 timeframe, which are the years of the Troika, the European Union, the IMF, and basically Germany did strongly sort of step into the Irish economic scene and required the imposition of austerity, for want of a better term. The really interesting puzzle that I think we have to contend with at this time frame is the fact that Irish people were so willing to absorb the moral strictures of the IMF and the European Central Bank at this time. There was a strong sense, I think, in the collective consciousness that, in fact, indeed, Irish people had partied too much in the sort of Celtic Tiger years, as they were known. Of course, people will maybe be familiar with the designation tiger for a country, right? Because if you think about the 1990s and the rise of the so-called Asian tigers, you get a sense of this idea of maybe a small country, an outlier that was never really supposed to make it, right, but somehow did, became economically prosperous and economically successful as a result of maybe planned economic development in the our corporate partnerships, this kind of thing, very, very much characteristic of the Asian sort of phenomenon. And indeed, you find that same model in Ireland. There was a generous dash of neoliberalism thrown in, of course, but it can't be gainsaid that without state involvement and special measures being sort of introduced to lead educational policy in the 50s and 60s to sort of lead the country out of a second world status and into a sort of a stage of advanced readiness to catch the wind of the economic boom of the sort of late 80s and into the 90s. Ireland simply wouldn't have been able to achieve what it did. So the cliche of the time was that the Irish had partied too much, and it had been fueled by a kind of genetic defect in the Irish psyche, which is that because we've been poor for so long and we had never really had to deal with success before, that we weren't really able for the big time, and so we had to turn to the adults in the room. We had to turn to the serious players, the Germans, the Europeans, in order to kind of temporarily take over our economic sovereignty and sort of show us how it's done. And for better or for worse, I think it's fair to say that Irish people internalized this kind of idea of it being a necessary hangover, a pain after the party, as Mark Blyth put it in his book on austerity, which of course was not a unique discourse to Ireland. It just happens to apply really well in the Irish context. But even Mark Blyth would not have, I think, expected such a convenient elite discourse to be so internalized by a population. It took a long time. It took years for Irish people, I think, maybe probably until 2014 or so, for Irish people to begin to sort of say, wait a second, this doesn't stack up, right? I mean, you've nationalized the banks here. You've foisted the debts of a lot of corporate development corporate developers, construction developers, if for want of a better term. You've foisted their debts onto the nation and absorbed them into the national debt, and basically bailed them out. You've bailed out the banks, and you're asking us to accept billions in costs that we as the people now have to pay back. So by the time 2014 comes around and you start to see Interestingly, the Troika had already left by this stage, but you begin to see a sort of an interesting affirmation of a principle that's quite well known in political science. Theda Skocpol and other people talk about this, that protesting in times of economic crisis never really happens as much on the way down as it does as you're beginning to kind of come out of it. And so in 2014, as the early signs of a recovery are starting to happen, the Irish government begins to openly talk about water privatization. And this is something we can get back to later in the discussion. But it's at that moment, the moment where water privatization becomes sort of an openly discussed issue among the editorial writing classes, among journalists, that you begin to see a real shift in the consciousness. And actually, the largest protests in the history of the entire country take place. Hundreds of thousands of people come out on the streets. Remember, keep in mind, it's a country with a relatively small population. I think there's just like maybe 5.5 million people in the actual republic itself at the moment. And to see that kind of such a large percentage of the country showing out on the streets to protest against water privatization is a big deal. There's a lot that more can be said about the question of those protests from a left strategy perspective and whether they were adequate to the challenge. But we're just kind of laying out the long sweep of the last 20 years here to answer your first question. And the elections that happened then, I believe, I may be getting the dates wrong on this, but I think there was a 2016 election. What's really interesting is to see how those politics did not play out. The water protesting politics did not really play out the way you would have expected for the left parties in Ireland. For those unfamiliar, Ireland has a number of left political parties, the most famous and largest of which is Sinn Fain. Typically, Sinn Fain has not sort of been a political consideration as a serious political party in the parliamentary politics of Dublin, but in that election, you start to see a real shift, a real increase. I think there's some. I'll check my figures in a second, but I think there's something like 34 seats returned. And what's interesting is that the smaller Trotskyist parties don't quite get the same wave. And there may be reasons to think about why that's so, that are rooted in the politics of that water protest moment, because there were serious disagreements among the different factions about how to sort of strategize and try to leverage gain from that moment. Probably the most significant moment for the Irish left in decades. Where that's left us today, I think, is that Sinn Fain came out of that moment as the serious left alternative, and it is Thomas Piketty has a very good analysis of this. Actually, it's gaining in successive elections, and it's polling very well right now this year, and probably on track to be a majority party, possibly in coalition in the next election. So it has, in a manner quite uncharacteristic for the European left, it has made these gains on the back of a very material kind of politics.
Well, I think we do need to talk about the nature of the difference between Sinn Fain and Ireland proper and the Republic of Ireland. Well, probably should say Ireland proper. Actually, we don't want to
Republic. The Republic in the north. Yeah,
we don't want to offend our Ulster brothers, but versus Sinn Fain in Northern Ireland, which I think is actually more understood in the United States, although its actual social democratic politics I don't think is actually understood in the US. But what is the politics of Sinn Féin? I remember looking at like this Irish party political breakdown once and being like, wow, there's a lot of options, and also I don't really understand all of them. So um
You
so
and me both. I mean, I'm not. There are some great sort of historians that are extremely well qualified to address these issues. Um, I can happily recommend some guests that'll do deep dives into this topic for you, and probably correct any one of a number of analytical mistakes I might make if I try to kind of rehearse this for you. But you do have a kind of an Irish Labour Party, I suppose, is the first place to start, which kind of like the British Labour Party has succumbed largely to a neoliberal agenda. Excuse me.
Mhm.
And one of the issues for them and why they have languished and nearly disappeared in Ireland, it's in the years since 2008, to be clear, is because when the crisis broke out, they were in a coalition with Fianna Fáil, which is seen as a very kind of cross between some kind of like maybe Gaullist party and a corporatist, corrupt, grifting kind of grassroots party representing small-time developers, large farmers, and bankers. The reputation of Fianna Fáil is very much, it's the party of the brown paper bag, and the kind of what that refers to in Irish politics, by the way, is there's usually cash in that bag, and it's being traded for political favors, usually in a very sort of undeclared way. You scratch my back, I scratch yours, and there's these kind of cozy, corrupt relationships that have been the number of the subject of a number of recent, and by recent I mean the last 20, 30 years or so, tribunals in the Irish courts, which have been looking into any number of forms of corruption that almost always emanate from Fianna Fáil as a party, although Fine Gael is by no means an exception to the rule here. So the Irish Labour Party is kind of ruled out for that reason, and it has not really done enough to kind of do the mea culpas in terms of its involvement in that moment. The Irish Labour Party would very much be a party of the sort of the Brahmin left, the sort of suburban, college-educated, identitarian. Not a word I'm necessarily comfortable with in an interview context like this, but hopefully it's a good shorthand here. And so it's
Americanized politics, you might
yes,
say?
certainly mid-Atlantic politics, probably very, very hot on the question of maybe Ireland participating in NATO in order to, for example, combat the influence of Vladimir Putin, blah, 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 right? So there is a very kind of, some might call it the Montrose left in Ireland, because in fact, it refers to the idea of Montrose and Donnybrook are sort of key areas geographically where we find Ireland's national broadcaster located. And a lot of the people who sort of the intellectual labor of the national broadcaster, which is by no means comparable to the BBC, although that would be sort of the natural inclination. It does not have the autonomy the BBC has from the state, and so it tends to sort of be an organization that embodies and channels the values and morals of this sort of Brahmin class of as you would put it, American leftists, American style leftists.
Yeah, this is something that I've noticed. We see this in the SPD, contemporary early in Germany, and the Greens. We've seen it
Right, it's a good example, yeah.
We saw it in a lot of the kind of center-left parties and Central and Southern Europe, the old socialist in France, etc. And what we have seen in a lot of those cases, with the exception of the SPD, which is currently in a coalition government, most of those parties actually very similar to a place like fucking Israel, where the Labor Party like dissolved. Effectively, I mean, it still technically exists, but it doesn't matter. A lot of these labor and socialist parties that had a kind of Brahmin left character, that allowed themselves to be neoliberalized, who took on concerns actually that seemed to come out of a weird. There's this weird mirror world effect that I remember when Macron was complaining about this, about, American politics in France. And I was like, yeah, the weird thing about that, though, is our weird frameworks come from you. Then we flip it back on itself and make it all American. And then we give it back to you and it's unrecognizable. But also, like, the other thing that I pointed out, that these center left parties in Europe will actually try to rule on ideas that the Democratic Party will appeal to, but never actually legislate, even at a local level. It's kind of an interesting problem, and we're seeing this dissolve in a lot of places, even in places that I consider strongholds of it, like Canada. So the Liberal Party's finally showing the inability to maintain that sort of stuff after a long run of Trudeau and
Right.
how Harper seemed to have completely, kind of like the way Bush did in the United States, completely gut and bankrupt the Conservative Party there. I think for me, like, when we talk about like Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, like, I do kind of know what they are, but because I really try to follow Irish politics to some degree for the way I have the thing that you should make fun of Americans for, where like we had some kind of weird Celtic ancestor and we're like totally obsessed.
I think that's okay.
Thank you. I will accept your blessing, but I actually do find it embarrassing.
If it's any consolation, the inverse, if that's the right, the mirror version of that is also true. That a lot of Irish people will kind of explain their kind of social credentials through the lens of how many family relatives have moved to the States and what sort of impact and splash they've made over there. Certainly politically, that's it's not an entirely uncommon sort of way for people to present themselves. So and any pub in Ireland is going to have its mandatory, black and white photo in the corner of JFK and the Pope. These American politicians, certain American politicians, are venerated in Irish political life for sure.
Yeah, it's something that I do get slightly embarrassed about when you're like, well, I have Irish roots, and I'm like, well, I have like 3 Irish ancestors. 2 are from Ulster, one's from County Cork, and like,
okay.
And like most of my ancestors are actually from Scotland, so like, in Wales. So it's, but there is an interest in like, my interest in British politics tends to be like, how can we screw over England? And
when they're not doing it to themselves.
Yeah. Here's the thing. Lately, I've just like, it's gotten sad now. I no longer even feel good about this. Like, you guys have gotten so good at doing all these stuff that I kind of wished upon you for you that I no longer get any joy from, and I just feel sorry for the British working class. So
to an extent, yeah. I mean, I don't. I shouldn't. I would be dishonest to an extent with your viewers and listeners if I were to say that in recent years, I have not sort of felt a little torn in terms of my own sort of commitment to things like Brexit and whatnot. I probably would have, a few years ago, I would have been much more staunchly opposed to Brexit. But I think as time has gone by, I kind of, without endorsing it, I have become at least more comprehending of an understanding of some of the arguments in favor of not even left Brexit, but just Brexit, full stop. I probably wouldn't have you know, I wouldn't have supported the original referendum, but certainly I think the intuition about not having a second referendum was it was the right thing to do. I think not to have a second referendum. I think that would have been incredibly counterproductive. Anyway, we're kind of off topic and talking
but
about the UK, but
I think we kind of have to some degrees,
yeah, of course,
because
right,
we are
yeah.
going to have to get to Ireland's relationship to the EU. And one of the things that
Yeah.
we think about the Celtic tiger nature of Ireland is, I've always heard it compared, like Ireland was like, well, it had two routes it could go. It could either go Greece or it could go Estonia, and it went Estonia kind of. And and so that was, my comparison. For those of you who don't know, Estonia is always listed as the good country that neoliberalized to get all the benefits for joining the EU and actually did benefit from it. Whereas most of the people who went through the austerity prescribed by EU membership actually hurt from it. And Ireland has been hard to characterize until recently, because it seemed to hurt from it for a long time. Then it seemed to go gangbusters for a little while, and it's back hurting.
Yeah, well, I mean, post-Brexit, I think a lot. Sorry, post-Brexit brain. I meant post-COVID. I think a lot of the sort of trusted analysis of where Ireland's economy is going has had to be maybe parked for a little while. It's very hard to have a crystal ball right now. A year or 2 years ago, people were very worried about inflation. Certainly, as the war broke out, that became an even greater. I mean, trying to put a tank of gas in your car for 80, 90 euros. I live in Texas. It's a third of that, if even, to fill my tank of gas in my car, and incomes aren't necessarily greater in Ireland. Traditionally, their incomes are in European incomes by and large are lower, but the social wage, as Michael Taft would put it, is greater. You've more access to more services,
right?
But the benefits of that get corroded over time by things like inflation, and especially when inflation is showing up in those regular kind of grocery basket items and gasoline and housing.
Yeah, when you have U.S. style inflation. So I mean, one of the things that when I say with U.S. style inflation is our 3% inflation mark, which I guess we're close to back down. That's the average. It never includes food, doesn't include housing, doesn't include any of that, right? It's all, and our consumer goods that are superfluous tend to be super cheap compared to the rest of the world. But actual things you need every day are not. One of the things I think the reason why I like the comparison to Estonia is because, like, Ireland was seen as like, well, we expected them to be Portugal. It turns out they're not. Which shrug as to what that actually means. But we know about our Central European brethren. By that I mean France and Germany. And I have watched this from afar. My first exposure to a lot of Irish people actually was not even when I was in Europe, which was 20 years ago, and in a completely different part of it. I've never actually been to the British Isles. It's something that's kind of funny.
We'll have to fix that.
My one threat was, if I ever come to London, it would be to invade. But that aside, I met a lot of Irish people actually in East Asia, because there were lots of Irish teachers who taught in Korea and Japan, and like lots actually.
I did. In 1999, I taught English in Korea, in Daegu.
I have family from Daegu.
No way.
Real. Yeah.
No way. That's fantastic.
I taught in Bundong at a university, but both from university teachers to Hagwons, it was Irish and Canadians.
Wow.
Americans were actually kind of rare if they weren't soldiers. And
That's actually true. I think I remember it being that way as well. A lot of Canadians,
well,
some
yeah,
Irish.
the Irish seem to have increased in the last, like, this was about 10 years after you were there, so this has been in like 2009, 2010. But and the Canadians, for people who don't know, Canadian like teacher policy is to overtrain for jobs. So like for every teaching job, there's like they actually create two candidates, so it's a highly competitive
Interesting.
situation, kind of artificially. So there's all kinds of teachers to be exported abroad, and since they actually, ironically, because they're quite well trained teachers, but they usually can't easily teach in the States, they often end up in Asia. So with Ireland, I just think comparative advantage to the won to the euro was not too bad, and so there was a lot of that there.
Okay, that's
But
interesting.
that's how I learned. Actually, where I actually got a better feel for like actual street politics in Ireland, as opposed to just like Americans romanticizing about the troubles.
I mean,
And
I think it's a fairly decent and interesting point to think about. Why do so many, even working class Irish people, train to do this sort of teaching abroad stuff and end up in places like Korea, Japan? It's it's an interesting, unique niche thing that Irish people seem suited for. I don't know why that would be so, and I don't know why they go to that type of work so much.
I think it's. I have my theories about the political economy of a place. It's like Ireland's industrial base has never been like the strongest.
Right. We've always had an immigration culture,
Right.
and
Yeah.
so
And
there's
it
a
is.
kind of a wanderlust that's part of that. I suppose it would be naive to think otherwise. As
And,
tragic as immigration has always been for Ireland, and let's be
right.
real.
Yeah. It's not. This is not a good policy. This is actually like akin to India, but you do have a decent education system. So
Yes,
like
that's a good point. Yeah.
those two things kind of that's great for brain drain.
Yeah. Yeah,
Which
it
again,
is.
see
It's almost
urban India for a similar policy set. That's interesting, actually. I was like, and is that because of British colonialism? It's actually never occurred to me until I said it right now. But I don't
I
know.
will say in the Irish context, I think the kind of that educational aspect that you were talking about a little while ago, and I'm not an expert, so anyone in the comments can correct me here, but the early version of the Irish not free state, but the sort of republic in the 1950s was very sort of centered on two things. One is kind of producing low tax zones that could be used to incentivize the creation of an industrial base, and then the other was creating a university structure, a third level education structure that would, be accessible to the population and would train people for technical scientific jobs. I mean, it can't be gainsaid. There was a very strategic policy in terms of charting the course for the country's future to do that.
Yeah, I think that's so. So to tie us back into what we were thinking about in terms of like contemporary Irish politics, it seems like and one way to understand it is the Republic of Ireland still has more European than say British politics, which really have since the 90s remarkably resembled the United States, even though it has a different constitutional basis. Whereas we've seen like the Labour Party in a left split from the Labour Party. We can see similar things. I said in Israel, although actually in Israel the left just collapsed. We've seen it in France to some degree. We've seen it explicitly in Greece. I get the feeling that it kind of happened with Podemos in Spain, but we have not. one of the things I think you pointed out, though, is Sinn Fain would actually be in a slightly different position than some of these populist left parties that emerged after Occupy, which unfortunately, like Syriza and Podemos, which unfortunately have discredited themselves as well at this point. So it's hard to see where that left goes because, they've stayed in their labor and socialist parties. They moved to a left coalitionary party that was a bit more populist bent, and that also seems to have failed them. And right now, the left seems to have very little electoral credibility. That's not the case in Ireland, which puts them in an interesting comparison to both Europe and the kind of economies that are vaguely, the similar size to them. I actually think it's a little bit unfair to compare them to Greece, but also they haven't fallen into this like trap in England where like the Tories, it really does seem like they could just like start shooting people in the street and have like a 90% disapproval rate and still Labour couldn't unseat them. So
due to the way the parliamentary votes are locked in. I mean, I'm afraid I can't remember the name of the British legislation that requires this. Maybe you do, Derek, but there is this legislation that says you can't have these you can't have a no confidence vote in the British Parliament for something like a 5-year period of time. Isn't that the case? Or if you can only do it like once a year, I think. And so you shoot your shot and that's it. Which means, you get these sort of long protracted periods of time where someone like Boris Johnson could just hold on because there's no real mechanism for removing him, which of course means that the public isn't exactly going to be able to sort of rally behind an opposition party as a sort of a champion of change. The change is kind of prevented. It's fairly anti-democratic, really, when you think about it. Right. Although, obviously, here is not that much different because you can't, we don't have a strictly parliamentary system here, and you can't vote out. You can't have a vote of no confidence within the House of Congress against the other party. It doesn't work that way.
Our federalism is particularly weird, and in some ways it makes it more unstable because you can completely flip the government every 4 years, and another case, like, however, in between those terms, it doesn't really matter how unpopular you are.
You can't do anything.
You can't really do anything. There are some states that have some ways of handling that, but the thing that it's hard to explain to Europeans, I know you know this, and my American audience will know this, but I have a significant European audience.
I know you do.
American elections are state issues, not federal ones. So there's literally 50 different sets of laws that govern U.S. elections, and only in the case of civil rights violations and like certain things promised in the Constitution does federal law actually ensure anything. So it's very hard to even talk about reform, which is why, for people who don't understand why we can't seem to get a third party in the United States, it's because it would take a reform of up to 50 different states' laws. Because our parties are both private corporations, effectively,
right,
and a lot of them are enshrined with legal protections in state laws that they don't have in federal laws. But you can't change them easily. So,
are in Nevada, even if you do overtake the party just leaves and forms another version of itself, and you're left holding the rump.
That's happened a couple of times. There's a couple of places where, like, what is it? It's one of the Midwestern states where the Democrats is like this leftover populist party, and that's what they go by in that state. It's like the farmer something party. But
I feel like
they're actually Democrats now. But so these things do happen. America's weird. But
that can't be denied. It can't be denied. Just to kind of speak to one of your points there, the interesting thing about Sinn Fain is how much the party has had to internally transform itself to become this, viable force in Irish politics. It's an odd trajectory. It's maybe not entirely unreasonable to compare it to the ANC. So you have, a kind of a party that is politically quite associated with, a terrorist organization, a nationalist terrorist organization for decades. And even though maybe Sinn Féin might have had electoral opportunities in the Republic, the state fairly stridently clamped down on their ability to speak directly to to Irish people. Um, Famously, I'm maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but when Sinn Féin politicians were being interviewed on the Irish media, because there was a rule saying that nobody from this organization could be, or any terrorist organization could be, that neither their image nor their words could be spoken on the airwaves. They would get actors to do it. So it was a way for the sort of media outlets to kind of get around this kind of idea of a soft censorship, as it were, on the airwaves.
I
It's
think
very,
I do
very
remember
interesting.
that, actually. I remember hearing that they had to get actors to do Sinn Féin interviews.
Yeah,
Like,
so
that's funny.
So it's not, a lot of Americans will associate Sinn Féin with the national struggles and the violence in the North that really kind of heated up in the 1970s and dominated the political landscape for most of my time living in Ireland. Let's be real, until the 90s really, and things began to sort of calm down. But there was a good 20 years where the Troubles were very, very much an active part of Irish political life. So how then does a party with that kind of association start to rebrand itself and kind of come in from the cold and become an acceptable face of a certain Irish left, right? It's an interesting question, and I don't claim to know all the answers here, but some of it's going to be to do with the fact that, much as in the United States and the distance of today's young people from 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's a certain kind of history is kind generationally, and as certain generations kind of mature and not necessarily die off exactly, but become cemented in their political preferences, newer generations emerge which don't have the same memories, don't have the same emotional memories, especially, right? Because I think a lot of people my age and older would be, certainly my father's generation would be, very sad, I think, to think that a political force that was so openly associated with the kind of violence that afflicted the country would be even seriously being considered for office right now. But as you can see this also in the way the TV show Dairy Girls, I don't know if you've ever watched it, kind of narrates this shift. This is a very important moment that it's narrating, which is the visit of Bill Clinton to Northern Ireland to sign and be part of the Good Friday Agreement, to be a witness and to help negotiate the Good Friday Agreement. This is seen as a major transformative moment in not just the politics of the North, but of the whole country. And in stops and starts beyond then, the violence starts to diminish, and if war is politics by other means, it starts to become politics again. I think beyond that point. So Sinn Féin is certainly still an old political party in Ireland. Probably, I think, actually the oldest political party in Ireland. All the other parties, I think, kind of stem from it at various times in Irish history. They've sort of broken off from Sinn Féin. It's the original mothership of an Irish sort of nationalist politics. going back a very, very long time. It's a conservative party socially in many ways, especially the older nationalist version of it. It hasn't always had socialist credentials. It has had a socialist wing since its establishment, but it hasn't always sort of been politically or socially progressive. It has had to deal with that element, that sort of lingering element within it that still sort of speaks that old language of the nationalist struggle. A generous chunk of that is materialist socialist in its orientation, but not exclusively. And it has had to kind of walk the line between, for example, at its national conventions every year, recognizing, for example, the continued status of what it refers to as its political prisoners, that is, people who are still serving jail time for terrorist activities in the 80s, on the one hand, and yet also trying to appear to be very modern and Corbyn-esque, Bernie Sanders-esque in its contemporary political formulation. So its opposition tries to saddle it with this older version of itself constantly. That's the way they believe that they will limit Sinn Féin's ability to penetrate into the mainstream electorate. By the look of things, that's a losing battle, but it's not ineffective. It does, I think. I mean, if I was in one of those opposition parties, if I was in Sinn Féin, Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil, that's what I would be doing too. It makes perfect sense. But again, I think demographics are, to a certain extent, destiny in Ireland. It is a young country, and it's the proof is in the pudding. Sinn Féin has been doing very well on the strength of its process of internal change.
So I guess that leads me to ask you something about demographics in Ireland. Is it a younger country than, say, Britain or most of continental Europe?
I would hazard a guess and say yes, it is. Okay. I don't have data right in front of me on that, but that's something I could probably look up for you and get back to you on. But yes, I would hazard a guess and say yes.
I would suspect so too, at least compared to the UK and the Nordic countries, which are pretty old demographically speaking. They're up there with the US and
late stage industrial. Yeah. I mean, also Ireland. It's worth noting that in after Poland and the Baltic countries were acceded to the European Union, Ireland had a massive influx of immigrants into the country, which was a very unusual thing for Irish people to have to experience. We normally very normally quite what's the word I'm looking for? Homogenous as a people. I think I've seen some statistics now that sort of suggest that actually, like, after English, Polish is the most commonly spoken language in the Republic of Ireland, not Gaelic, which, I mean, that wasn't like that when I left the country, but, it certainly seems to be that way now.
Are attitudes about Slavic peoples as negative in Ireland as they are in
not in my experience, no.
Okay.
I think for whatever reason, Irish people have been receptive to immigration. This is actually something that's remarked on, is like why there is no Irish far right per se. I mean, you do get, this is what I was saying to Jason Miles on the This Is Revolution show a couple of weeks ago. There's certainly some elements of what we call kind of right-wing sentiment in Ireland. There's the obvious ones that are kind of largely the biggest right in Ireland is kind of clustered around economic libertarianism, really, with the electorate that supports especially Fine Gael. And
which is weird. I mean, it does seem like Ireland's one of the few places that still has economic libertarians or
yeah. The sort of
all.
classical Tory
Right.
economics, right? Let's be real. But then once you sort of step outside of that, and this is where my sort of knowledge becomes a little more anecdotal, so forgive me, but a few times I've been home in the last year or two, it's been noticeable, for example, that there were movements, and there seems to be an overlap here between the anti-abortion movement and also the kind of COVID skeptic, anti-vaccine, anti-mask libertarian movement as well. I mean, I think I'm probably right on that, just based on the kind of names I'm seeing cropping up in newspapers, and knowing the positions that these various op-ed writers take on these different topics. You can see this overlap, at least in the media space. So the Irish right, in that sense, would maybe there'd be kind of a strange overlap between the kind of religious motivated position on abortion and then the kind of oddly flip of that, my body, my choice, vaccine hesitant group, and square that circle for me. I'm not sure I can do it, but there hasn't really been an alt-right emerge in Ireland. Some smattering of men's rights activism, that's part of this cluster that I was just describing. But in terms of like a far-right presence, like you'd see in mainland Europe, it just doesn't seem to have shown up in Ireland yet.
Do you think that maybe... So way back, there was a scholar, I believe his name is Stephen Bruce, who talked about why secularization Steve Bruce, secularization in Europe and America, and he was actually a big predictor of American secularization of this generation, and called it about 15 years before it happened.
Wow.
But he actually, one of the interesting observations he said about Catholicism in Ireland is that Irish identity being wedded so much to religion means that it doesn't entirely have the same racial character of a lot of other post-European national projects. And that leads to two things that are kind of interesting. One, it means religion actually still plays some role in civic life, although that is changing seemingly. I was going to ask you about the nature of political Catholicism in Ireland, because it does confound me a bit.
Absolutely.
Two, it means that Irish identity, despite like in American heads, we seem to think of Irish as a racial type almost, of which like
no accident there.
Yeah, of which half of us claim ancestry because it looks better than being English. But and I mean, there are in a real sense almost, I think there's more Irish descended people in the United States, even for real, than there is in Ireland. But there is just the scale of the country makes it more likely. One of the things that I think about in regards to this, though, is I find that argument somewhat convincing. But what's interesting to me is, like, it doesn't stop anti-immigrant sentiment in Poland for them to also have an identity that's so heavily Catholicized. But it does seem to in Ireland. And and it also,
I think I can help you with that. I mean, the Polish Catholicism, I'm not an expert, but I mean, so far as I've ever encountered this question before, throughout the former Soviet bloc, religion has been a vector for social conservatism in a very sort of strident sense, because it was a permissible way of holding on to a kind of a certain anti-communism, and
you could hide your reaction and not get totally persecuted for it. Like
perhaps, yeah, but I think also religion was largely restricted in former Soviet, in a lot of former Soviet countries. And if you look, I know wasn't a Soviet country, but Yugoslavia is a good example here. It's the case I'm more familiar with than Poland, but the pro-Catholic swing in the 90s in like places like Croatia is indicative here, I think, because it was a way of kind of recasting oneself in the aftermath of the sort of implosion of the secularist communist Yugoslavia. One could sort of find an identity, find a way of belonging in the new sort of in the new type of freedom that ex-Yugoslavia was experiencing. I suppose conflict obviously played a massive role there too. So that's not something that's present in the Polish case, but I think some of those dynamics would still apply. Where I wanted to kind of distinguish Ireland here and Irish Catholicism, obviously many of the same kind of doctrinal trends would still be influential. I mean, I think it's no accident that Ireland has had a long time out in the cold in terms of its national policies on abortion and indeed divorce being illegal until I can't remember, it was the 80s, I think, where divorce became legalized. Certainly, I remembered in my lifetime, so either the 80s or the early 90s. That said, I want to try to loop in a few things here. Irish Catholicism has also had in Ireland a very unique kind of opportunity. Maybe that's not the right word, but it has also been a kind of a fertile ground for the left, insofar as the Irish national struggle was perceived as a struggle also for the autonomies of Catholicism, but not necessarily in this anti-communist sense that it would have been in Eastern Europe, but rather to the contrary, in the opposition to the crown and unionism and Protestantism ipso facto, you find a sort of an opening more to almost like, or at least, look, Irish perspective, the Irish intuition when it comes to foreign policy has always been very left-wing. This is an interesting thing for a country that has a profoundly kind of conservative social demographic. Ireland has long recognized the Palestinian struggle. Ireland is one of the very early countries to, actively boycott the importation of South African goods in a sort of a demand to put a stop to apartheid. Irish Catholic orders were connected with and sponsors of the liberation theology of, South Central American leftists.
So you're the only European country that has liberation theology in its veins.
Your words, not mine, but I would find it hard to contest that assertion.
I greatly appreciate your humble scholarly rigor, but I do think there is something very specific about the fact that the fighting nation, the antagonist for Irish Catholicism is not communism. It's not even like a laicist French state. It's a Protestant colonial order, right. And interestingly, that's also meant that I'm sure there is an integral. I was going to ask you, is there an integralist Catholic movement in Ireland? Because this is another interesting thing. You don't seem like, even in Latin America, there's a very polarized, two polarized Catholic political spaces, and maybe even three. I was trying. For patrons, I did a show on liberation theology recently, actually, and in Latin America and in the
Cool.
United States. And one of the things that I talked about in this regard is how, like, if you look at the theological orientations of the various both Protestant groups and the various Catholic internal orders, and if people who aren't Catholic, and luckily, the Irish and part of the Slavic part of my family are Catholic, so I know this, and the other part's Jewish. So it's something that I'm a little bit aware of, because I've had both, like, liberation theology heads in my family and the outer thing, and people who are sympathetic to Opus Dei's and the Legionaries of Christ. So
it doesn't make sense, right? But
right,
nevertheless,
right. So what I haven't seen out of Ireland that I even see in Latin America is this kind of integralist, almost phalangist kind
so
of
you're
movement.
okay. Maybe you can do me a favor here, because I'm not sure I know what you mean by integralist, and that might be just a gap in my reading. But maybe you could just explain a little bit more about.
So
Is it phalangism, or is it?
phalangism is a type of it, but in
Okay.
Latin America, it's not phalangist. Typically, for example, if you think about, like, the right wing of the Legionaries for Christ, then they're politically aligned movements in
Okay.
Central America, like the Argentinian junta. Those are generally considered
Francoist Spain, perhaps.
Yeah,
Okay.
Francoism and phalangism is kind of the model.
Okay.
What I would say is, take distributism, which Catholics will know what I'm talking about, but everyone else is going to be lost. And had a little bit of fascism, and but remove the racial components and replace it with religious identity, and also maybe a boner for the Habsburg Empire. And
wow,
that's integralist. And there is that in Latin America. Like, Latin American reactionaries do not fuck around. Like, they are super reactionary. I don't see that in Ireland. I guess maybe because, like, I don't know, maybe you don't have a monarchical tradition to attach it to.
No, but I think you can see something along the lines of what you're talking about, maybe in the sort of stereotype, at least, of De Valera's Ireland. De Valera being the first president, and as many people will know, he was a American citizen, and sort of part of that initial sort of 1916 moment, and a very sort of, I would say, Gaullist figure in Irish political life, but certainly, a traditionalist in terms of his values. If De Gaulle was kind of a military patrician figure, De Valera didn't really have quite those credentials, and would tend to lean a little heavily on the sort of social conservative vision of Ireland. There's a sort of a very, I'm not even sure if this is apocryphal or not, but there's always this kind of myth of De Valera as being someone who kind of advocated for a small Ireland, the Ireland of the kind of movie Inish Éireann. If you you kind of imagine that kind of rustic life, and the cliche is the comely maidens dancing at the crossroads kind of thing. So I don't think that quite meets your criteria for integralism, as you're calling it, but it's part of it. In terms of actual Irish fascist,
you do have those.
Well, yeah, I suppose, who doesn't? But the connection there is more going to be with Fine Gael, because in fact the sort of notion there, what a pseudonym for Fine Gael is always like the blue shirt party, right? And that, if you go back far enough, the blue shirts were a kind of a semi-fascist party or group in their origins. So that's not something that's brought up in polite company nowadays, but it's it's true. it's part of their origin. Don't know if that helps you, or I mean, I think one thing to sort of consider moving forward, though, because I think your question is a good intuitive question that kind of flows from, I think, where I had kind of left my account of the sort of internal transformation of Sinn Fain.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the ability of Sinn Fain to leave its kind of Catholic identification in the past, to leave its nationalist identification in the past, and move forward as a kind of modern European internationalist secular party is very much in the balance right now. I think it will be very interesting to see how they move forward. For those who don't follow it all that closely, one of the decisive moments for Sinn Féin was when Mary Lou MacDonald became the leader of the party in the Republic of Ireland, and when Gerry Adams, the former leader, stepped aside. He was a long time leader of that party, and generations at its helm. That, I think, was a very decisive moment in determining and showing to the public where Sinn Féin was going. It was no accident they placed a woman born in the Republic without the kind of characteristic Sinn Féin Northern Irish affectation. So you now have a young Gen X female leader with a Dublin accent, a very working class Dublin accent, and so in terms of like the spokesperson, the identity of Sinn Féin, I think is now sort of strategically, at least you can kind of see where they're going. And so, one question I would have, Derek, not necessarily of yourself, but just in terms of my own curiosity of where the country's going from here, is whether Catholicism as a sort of a part of Irish life, like everywhere else, church attendance has declined dramatically. It's very hard even to find Irish-born priests to serve as pastors in these churches. More and more, you're seeing priests come in from overseas, and it's not clear to me what kind of role faith has in Irish society anymore.
It seems like Irish secularization has kicked up pretty quickly. I mean, when I think about like liberalization of marriage and abortion,
yeah, massively in my lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, like from what I remember hearing about Ireland as a kid in the 80s and 90s, and what happened, like, I don't know, like before it even happened in the States, was like, what, Ireland's a country to do that? Like, it was like, well, something's changed very quickly.
Right.
And in that sense, it's one of the few ways where the Irish secularization seems to remind me of the U.S., where it's finally happening, but it's happening like a generation to a generation and a half later of like more secular state developed Europe. Though I suspect the reasons for it looking the same are completely different. Like and that's something I would love to do more research in, because it used to be, when you were talking about the non-secular developed world, the two places you would bring up was the United States and Ireland. The United States being Protestant AF, and Ireland being Catholic. And now, I mean, in the United States, the largest singular Christian religious group is the Catholic Church, and thoroughly. Although I think there's still technically more Protestants than Catholics, but they're so divided over so many different movements that like the Catholic Church actually has a kind of an even bigger influence than you think it would here. And also, just if you deal with people younger than me and you, their likelihood of being religious is a quarter flip, as opposed to in my generation where it's like 75%, and the generation above me where it's like 81, 82%. So it's been relatively rapid. What I think is interesting, though, is this point about Sinn Fain, about this appeal. We were talking about the Brahmin left of like the Labour Party in the beginning.
Yes.
But one of the things about like putting a working class woman as the face of the party is you actually do sort of diffuse some of those criticisms that you might get about.
That's it. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's they've been very clever about it, I think, to be honest. It's no accident. Given that Sinn Fain often would be kind of a target of criticism by those who perhaps represent that more suburban perspective, that suburban left-wing perspective.
So I this is one thing I don't understand about let's say settlement policy in Ireland, and by I don't mean the English coming in. I mean like where people actually live. So in continental Europe, suburbs are slums, basically. I mean, and in the United States, we have seen a flip to this European style city model where we went from like urban blight and suburbs being where everybody ran to in the last 10 years is actually inverted, and the suburbs are now looking more and more like the suburbs of Mexico City or France, which is
interesting.
Which is kind of a bad thing in so much that like the city actually has infrastructure for poor people and the suburbs really doesn't. But now that infrastructure is now priced at a premium, so
great point.
The poor people pushed out. That again, like I think when you talk about Ireland, it sounds like it still actually maintains like the like for most of my life, the American pattern where suburbans where the middle class moved. Is that still true? Is it what is it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd sort of probably need to talk and think it through at the same time, if you know what I mean, to give you an answer. I'm thinking about the fact that I lived 10 years of my life in Columbus, Ohio, before moving to where I live now, and in that 10 years, I saw that city change
my mom lived
dramatically.
In Columbus.
Yeah. There you go. And it's a great city. I really liked it. When I first moved there in 2008, it was not as pretty. It was a lot poorer than it was in 2018 when I left. The amount of I guess what we'd call phenomenally gentrification, but I think it's more complicated than that. That took place in the downtown of Columbus was really dramatic, and it did squeeze out a lot of indigent peoples, various shelters, and low cost housing facilities were bulldozed, removed to allow this sort of encroachment of very high-rise sort of hotel projects and kind of nightlife, restaurant, dining, high street retail type culture has kind of emerged there in a very. It was always kind of there in a kind of an offbeat, hip, punky kind of way, but it's really become very bougie. If I may say.
Cheap town, cheap post-industrial town that people come into to like because it's so cheap, and then
they flag a lot that they want to look like Austin, Texas, and having now that I've moved to Texas and I've been to Austin a couple of times, I think I see it's kind of working, right? I mean they're achieving their goal, put it that way. Not saying that goal is a good goal by any means. Now just thinking about Dublin then, and I don't know if this answers your question, but one thing I would say is that Dublin is a hard city to understand from an American perspective in some ways because it's not gridded the way Midwestern and East or West Coast rather cities are. It is sort of very much premised on a kind of a medieval squiggly streets and whatnot downtown. Not exactly, Haussmann's Paris either. It's properly an old city, and as a result, it has kind of always had a kind of a natural tendency towards mixed use planning in the downtown areas. I think people do choose to live downtown, especially with the arrival in Ireland, and this is something I should have gotten into earlier on, by the way. The fact that so many of the .coms have opened headquarters in the old sort of port district of Dublin and taken up residence there. Ireland, I was going to mention earlier on, in the 90s, wasn't for nothing that the New York Times referred to Ireland as the Wild West of European capitalism. Because it really was, with kind of a sort of a Singapore-style low-tax structure, trying to bring in a lot of these multinationals to set up. And of course, these companies do employ a lot of people, and they have to live somewhere. And the plan is kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with Buenos Aires at all, but it's the same kind of idea. Like the docklands have been converted. I guess London has similar structure as well. The docklands kind of get converted. These old port warehouses and whatnot get converted to being apartment blocks and whatnot. So you have that in Dublin, but I think most people still have an ambition to kind of get out of the city at some point. If you're young, maybe you want to live there in one of those smaller apartments. They're very, IKEA catalog style places, very slick, but small, right? And maybe not a place to raise a family. You're on the third floor, fourth floor, whatever. You're not going to have access to much of a garden. And there is, I think, a sort of a desire or a yearning to have that sort of semi-detached house in the suburbs still. And given the size of Dublin, you can kind of do it. Bus routes are generally serve the suburbs well, at least better than most American cities that I can think of. And
to be fair, that would not be hard.
No, it's not hard. And late night buses are not easy to get in Dublin. And, generally people have to get a taxi home if they're out partying at a certain hour of the night, right? But I think people do still kind of yearn for that kind of little patch of garden, semi-detached house.
And that's still possible in Ireland then. And I've always kind of tried to figure that out because it's not a particularly large country.
It's a very expensive place to have a house now. So again, this was sort of something I apologize. I kind of overlooked this in my introductory remarks, but I mean, the 2008 crisis decimated the construction sector, and it has never really recovered. And to be really brutally honest about this, one of the major reasons Sinn Fain is doing well in Ireland is because of its absolute insistence on the question of housing as a kind of a public right. Ireland has not engaged in public housing construction in decades. It has constantly relied on the private sector to provide housing solutions. But given that the market hasn't, literally a growing population has not been served by new construction of basic affordable housing for decades now, not since 2008, that there's a real burgeoning demand. Now, if you're a middle class family who already owns your home and you're locked into a low interest mortgage, you're probably sitting pretty because it doesn't affect you, right? You're happy where you are. But for young families, even in the middle class, who are seeking to, on early stage career salaries, to get that semi-detached home that I was telling you about, that's kind of still the Irish mythical kind of symbol of having arrived as an adult. That is, even for middle class people, I think, going to be a really big concern when it comes to the ballot and how you cast your vote.
Well, that's interesting because that does mean Ireland has a trend on home ownership that it is somewhat similar to the United States. I mean, Britain has a similar problem, but
yeah, it's an Anglo phenomena. People in Germany don't really identify with that because they're much more apartments, used to living in apartments, whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when my one foray of living in Europe was in Germany, and I do remember like apartments were basically homes, and everyone thought about them as such. And
That's right.
you also, I remember coming in and like, wait, your apartment comes with nothing. But anyway,
Yeah.
but it was it's interesting to think about, whereas like you do have this Anglo home ownership thing, but the other thing it leads to is this weird. One of the things I try to explain about why are Americans so obsessed with generational politics, and I'm like, well, when you turn of age and benefit from this or that arbitrary interest rate, um, and what the home valuation is when you enter the market makes a huge difference to your wealth possibility, and it's basically based on arbitrary relationships to time. Like, did you buy a home at the right time or not? Like, if you bought a home in 2007 because you had a little bit of that extra cash right during the beginning of the downturn and you didn't lose it, you are in a great position right now. Whereas that if you waited even till you waited till uh 5 years ago,
Right.
I mean, you are in a good position in regards to your interest rate, but not your home cost. And right
Yeah.
now, you're in a good position on neither. So, like, this is hard to explain, and it's also like almost all wealth accumulation of any significant amount. If you are not, have have like a labor aristocratic middle class job, what you might call either PMC. I also include like trade crafts and stuff have these kind of, because they have great benefits and whatnot, but everybody else is kind of shut out of that possibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But even they can't get into these houses anymore. I mean, like I had heard that Ireland is facing a similar problem and also doesn't have a culture of like apartment ownership, apartment inhabiting being seen as equivalent to ownership. Like, let me rephrase that. So,
I mean, that might come in a couple of generations, but we're not there just yet. And I appreciate your point about generational politics as well. I mean, if anyone's curious, I do an occasional podcast called Fully Automated, and one of our guests a couple of years ago was Keir Milburn, who wrote a book. I think it was called Generation Left, and he's British commentator. Not a if you're British, you'd be familiar with his voice from Novara Media podcasts. Well, his argument, I think, largely backs up what you're saying, which is that the left-right distinction in that sort of post-Occupy moment is very much a generational one, and so what he's trying to do in some ways is trying to explain, on the one hand, the okay boomer sort of meme culture on the one hand, like why that makes sense to people, but also in another way, like just to sort of put the brakes on it a little bit and just try to remind everyone that it's also very much a class distinction. This is the important thing to remember here, is that there's residual lumps of saved capital that middle class people here and there have access to, generally people who are older, but that's getting chipped away at it all the time. And subsequent generations, obviously, if you have more than two children, that's going to be splitting up that lump, and so there's a kind of a downward mobility effect. One thinks also of the the so-called graduate with no future that preoccupied a lot of the Occupy Wall Street people, and those are real, I think, sociological phenomena. What it means in Ireland, I think, again, is just pointing to this thesis I was arguing for earlier on, that Sinn Fain is the party that's uniquely positioned to kind of reap that harvest, because it's the only party, and I'm quite serious about this right now, it's the only party that's really making any kind of sense on housing. It's the only party that is literally willing to face down it might be hard for non-Irish people to grasp this, but the entrenched power of the property developing class in a small country like Ireland is formidable, especially when, as I say, there hasn't really been a state-led housing project for decades. And by that, I mean state constructed. I mean, the state itself has not built homes in Ireland in a very long time. American audiences might have a tough time getting their head around that as a concept, but it used to be a thing. And in Britain,
it was
it very much has been a thing. Yeah.
It was a thing here until the 80s. I mean, the thing is, but our millennials do not remember a time when there's been significant public housing. I mean, like that. In fact, the way to try to deal with the lack of significant public housing in the United States is very ineffective use of block grants.
Nobody in Ireland can. Yeah. But I mean, Derek, you can tell me. But I mean, I don't. One thing, at least, though, in terms of how American capitalism seems to be working, is at least there does seem to be some semblance of fluidity in the market for housing. Where I mean,
and there's a lot of subsidized.
You're not finding these middle class people. Young middle class people are not roadblocked, right? And I have criticisms of this, by the way. I'm not hugely a fan of fastening my left wing identity to what are ultimately kind of middle class demands. I sometimes have questions in my mind about why are we demanding college debt forgiveness and not free college? I know there's like short-term strategic reasons why that's so, but it often seems to me to be kind of an alienating demand for 40% of Americans who never set foot in college. And I'm a university professor. I mean, I'm a university professor. I shouldn't be saying these things, right? Don't tell anyone.
Well, I mean, my big critique of student debt forgiveness is that it doesn't fix any of the structural problems whatsoever. Not that,
absolutely.
I'm not one of these people who is like, oh, these people don't deserve it. There's a lot of even poor people in the United States. I think of working class people of color, everyone's favorite demographic, who get suckered into all kinds of loan schemes and don't get degrees and just get settled with a lot of debt. However, one-time debt forgiveness fixes none of that. It actually and it doesn't fix the need for it. It doesn't fix the fact that maybe some of this is because we've let the public infrastructure and public schools completely fall fucking apart. And, if you fix those issues, then maybe this wouldn't be that big a deal. Plus, I also agree with you. Now, I even have my criticisms of free university, because where I have seen it tried in a way that actually ends up meaning that the rich of a country actually benefit more from the free education, because what they do is they'll only open a few schools. This is true. Like the prestigious state schools in Korea are free, South Korea, but your advantage on getting into them still privileges wealth. So it actually leads to this fact where now you have a wealthy cadre of people getting this very good free education that's really prestigious, whereas the majority of the country is taking on massive amounts of debt to get any credential to get a job. It doesn't have to be that way, but if you don't set it up right, it ends up that way. So and even in a place like Germany, where it's not as big of a deal, and the reason why it's not a big a deal in Germany is Germany does invest significant amounts of money into vocational training and support, and so education as class mobility is not seen as big a deal as just making sure working class people are taken care of. And this is not to say that Germany is not a neoliberal hellhole like everywhere else. It still is, but it's
somewhat less of a neoliberal hellhole.
Right. Well, it's like my friends in Sweden who talk about how much they've become a neoliberal hellhole, and I'm like, yes, you're right, but I just want to remind you the difference about where you're at and where we are.
The Anglo version of it is a lot more anarchic, shall we say?
Yeah. But so where was I going this? But it does.
Well, higher education and.
Well, I was going to ask you about this because this, I do think this generational stuff is a class problem. But what's interesting is, for example, millennial leftism. And I know a lot of people get mad that I refer to lefts by their generational archetype in the United States, and I don't do it elsewhere, but it's for the reason that we're just talking about.
It makes sense to me.
Right.
To do it as a shorthand.
Yeah. as
Not
a media
perfect, but
culture. No, it's not
yeah,
perfect, but
yeah.
one of the things that has been, I think, discussed by someone like Kristen Parenti, I think somewhat accurately,
Okay.
is you would think that the splitting, Barbara Ehrenreich really thought that the PMC was going to have a function with part of it because it was downwardly mobile and being proletarianized, would have a function as skilling the working class and tying in with them and having common interest in them, and around Occupy when she was still alive,
Right.
and so active. That was a viable thesis, I think. What I think has changed, and my criticisms of PMC thesis aside,
Sure.
is that there has been an allegiance of rentier capital with a lot of these downwardly mobile people because they see their interest as being able to enter that in a way that has stopped them completely from adopting a broad working class friendly left paradigm, which has led to an acceleration of the decoupling of class politics with the Democratic Party in a time period where left ideas, even ones that seemingly would have been more concessionary to labor, literally like go join a fucking union, um,
Yeah.
thus have not really had the same purchase. And Christian Parenti has talked about this because, and I think he's picking up on the Brenner Riley thesis, although he didn't see it as positive as Brenner and Riley did. For those of you who don't know,
Okay.
that's the what is it, the 7 theses on Biden and Bidenism or whatever.
All right.
And he was also responding to Peter Turchin because Peter Turchin's like, well, there's going to be an inter-elite civil war, and he's like, no, there's not, because so many of these downwardly mobile leftists do have a floor, and that floor is access to like rentier stuff patronized by government contracts. Now, what I think is interesting is I think that actually broadly does parallel the de-radicalization of like the dirtbag left and all that we saw, and Occupy and all that.
Okay. Can you connect it for me a little better, maybe?
Well,
I'm not sure I'm grasping, because I mean, I've always seen that as kind of maybe not sufficiently or in a sufficiently robust or self-aware way, but I've always seen the kind of dirtbag thing as a sort of a mutant strand in the sort of PMC culture. Like it seems to be quite. I mean, when you think about the notion of the black pill, the leftist or whatever have you, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I'm just curious about that.
Well, so to expand on that a little bit, you have seen a lot of the people who made structural critiques of the center left of the Democratic Party and the like, even the right wing of the progressive movement, make the same defenses of their people, the squad or whatever, and structurally identical arguments to say what a Warrenite would have made for like Ro Khanna before. Why is that? Well, to me, it seems like they're more and more invested in this idea of a technocratic patronage economy, which they have also been sold on this mostly through monetary schemes as an ability to offset that. And while they're not hostile to working class politics, they still talk working class language. They're still going to talk union stuff. There has been a just blanket denial, for example, of economic stagnation from people like Seth Ackerman. Like, and if you talk to working class people, they are not experiencing this as like a great heyday for themselves of government largesse. And what is weird to me, I mean, is that standard level Democratic like pollster pundits are more aware of this than say people who write for Jacobin magazine and were the kind of intellectual people that you go to after you got introduced to the left from Chapo Trap House. And so that
okay, I get it now. Yeah.
Right, so I actually think whether like the phenomenon is broader than that. But if you even just look at that tendency,
well, yeah, it's so interesting you bringing this up, because someone I generally do have an admiration for, and I think she's sharp. I don't always agree with her intuitions or instincts, but Brianna Joy Gray has been really going deep into this territory that you're sort of setting out here. The last couple of days, would you believe, on the show that she does, Rising on YouTube, which I admit I watch quite a lot. I find it at least informative and usually thought-provoking. One thing she's been saying, and I think in a very eyebrow-raising way, just as you also have now, or at least asking the question, why is it the Young Turks are, like, right now, are so strongly behind Biden? Why is it that a lot of left-wing media outlets that were maybe Bernie-cratic in 2016, 2020 are now kind of weighing in and sort of saying, like, we have to be serious about the good things that Biden has done economically. I think I can speak for you, Derek, and I here with some confidence that this is not going to work, right? There's a massive amount of economic anxiety out there. Inflation
comes off as gaslighting your own electorate, is what it comes off as.
Yeah. It also just comes off as what's the word that people use? Cope.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's structurally the same thing that we critique the Clintonites for doing in 2016. It's like it is structurally identical. And that's what blows my mind, because it means the same people who are making that critique of the Clintonites, the America was always great strand of blue MAGA, basically, that they are now making the same argument, not even for their guy.
The only people now who seem to be saying this with any kind of audience in any sort of vaguely left-wing sense is like Jimmy Dore and a handful of other people that a lot of mainstream leftists, as they grow older out of the era of Occupy and the Bernie wave, think is an absolute creep. And it's strange that I'm not going to speak for Jimmy Dore. I find a lot of his positions very defensible, some not so much, but I'm sure he would be the first to say it's not a good thing for us collectively that he is the person that is being left to make these kinds of arguments.
Well, it's funny. I've been accused of tailing Dore, which amuses me.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it amuses me because I've also been accused of hating on Dore because for reasons that are complicated. And what I will say is, what I've specifically said even a year ago is, like, I often don't agree with most of Dore's solutions. I'm probably too much of a standard Marxist for that, even though I even have critiques.
I get it. I get it. Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. Yeah.
But what do you want? If you want to, and there's times where, like, I like Sam Cedar enough. He said good things about broad left tendencies. However, if you're going to actually listen to someone on what the Democrats are likely to do, Dore's track record is objectively better than Cedar's. And so, like, it's just, whether or not you like what he has to say, whether or not you like his positive political analysis, is kind of irrelevant to calling what, say, the Squad is going to do or whatever. And it's beyond the scope of this here. What I think,
but again, just as a footnote to that, I mean, it's very interesting to me, and forgive me, I don't want to talk over you or divert us from a very important discussion here, but I will just say, on a personal level, it's interesting to me that, again, someone I have many disagreements with, but Brianna Joy Gray has been able to trace in the positions that she has taken on a number of these things, you know, quite unique and iconoclastic positions, and is in a sense often the more sort of intellectual, articulate, acceptable face of a number of Jimmy Dore's positions, be it Ukraine war, be it, you know, even going back, you know, force the vote, and I'm just kind of losing my this idea of the rail workers strike and the possibility that the squad could have intervened to maybe do something at that moment to kind of win more support for the rail workers, which is, I guess, we're already going back to the start of this year with that. But you know, who else out there is really saying these sorts of things? But it's interesting that she has that platform and has, I think, just been a brave person. I think in general, even if I don't agree with everything she says, I think she's brave to in this moment where, as you rightly say, a lot of the people that we were kind of turning to for intellectual guidance in the 2016-2020 period do seem to sort of stutter and hesitate now, for whatever reason. I don't fully understand it, but they hesitate in the face of conceding any strikes on Biden. I think they're just incredibly worried about Trump being reelected. And so the Trump derangement syndrome, if we can use the phrase, I'm not sure if you're amenable to using it, but it does seem to be very strong. Calling it that is not sociologically accounting for it. Derek, that's where I'm going to maybe turn to you for some help with this, because I think that's where you were about to go with your point. But it's a real phenomenon. I think it's incredibly depressing for me. I'm not going to lie.
Well, the sociological accounting, you know, and I want to make people understand these are not Marxist points. These are just banal sociological points tied into.
We're just two guys,
right,
chatting it up here,
right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not doing formal class analysis here because, well, frankly, traditional formal class analysis is hard to do because Marxists do not generally concern themselves with wealth outside of productive capital holdings traditionally. And I mean, yes, we hate the rich, but like, we're not looking at like income gradients among workers traditionally. In fact, Marx actually warns against that. But I think we do have to understand the current situation with this, like, educated strata. Half of what is interesting about it, and I think this is under theorized, this part of it, is there's also something we haven't talked about, which there really was in the 90s, a push of a lot of the best and brightest of the working class into colleges. I am an example of it. And a lot of my peers were just told, if you don't go into colleges, there's no future for you because the jobs that we relied upon are gone. And so,
interesting.
So there's a professionalization of a large strata of people who traditionally would have gone into the trades, are into industrial labor, or into logistics work. And while some of us have ended up back there anyway, not myself, I've been very lucky, but I think that's under discussed as this, and I think that might be one of the weirder dividing lines right now, because you have this downwardly mobile people who came from, you know, the fail sons of dentist is a stereotype for a reason, right?
Fail sons of dentists?
Yes, like, I mean,
I haven't heard that one before. That's good.
But like, you know, professional, like, I cannot tell you how many leftists, including PMC critics, frankly, who, like, their parents are doctors, they did not have that, they don't even have access to the same amount of wealth, but they do have, like, they can go, you know, they can go live at home for 4 years if you need to. And like, I think that's led to an interesting tension in like the Occupy milieu, because and I use the Occupy milieu because I think a lot of the DSA milieu is actually really from the collapse of that 90s movementist left that Occupy signals the end of, right?
You're right. That's a good point. That's a very good point.
So to tie this all together, I do think what a lot of people see right now in the Democratic Party is the possibility for patronage out of the idea that you have to stimulate consumption for economic growth, and thus that opens up a place for them to get patronage from rent-seeking relations to the government, and that's in the tech sector and whatever. That's how they exist. That's how they got to where they are, even if they're not getting it now. And
right.
I think that distorts our politics. The reason why I brought this long diversion in U.S. politics is actually relevant to Irish politics, because I want to triangulate this.
Sure.
In British politics, what we've seen is the utter collapse and disintegration of the millennial left into, I don't even know what. Like, I've not got a good feeling for where it's ended up. But all these
we could do a whole podcast on this,
right? On momentum and all that, and even like Navarra Media's move from like autonomism.
It's pretty bad.
It's all gone effectively, and a lot of those people are like, now some of them are like left-wing cultural warriors. Some of them are right-wing cultural warriors. It's very strange where all that's ended up.
Yeah.
Conversely, in America, you do have people on the kind of pink Democrat left, even some who wanted an independent party movement, I think braying for scraps at the Biden movement, and utterly terrified that the administrative state might actually take a hit, because that's the only way they can imagine the stabilization of their position.
That's it. I think you put your finger on it right there. That's a great point. Yeah.
Which means that like they're way more concessionary to the same people they were critiquing just a mere 8 years ago. And that's not just because they grew up. It's because like the politics have had a certain trajectory. And
well,
if anything,
for a man who just said he wasn't doing class analysis, that sounds pretty good to me, Derek. I think you've just given a good back of an envelope sketch of what an analysis like of a class analysis this would actually look like.
Well, so what I want to pivot to about Ireland is, so why hasn't Ireland, in its kind of its own post Occupy Dublin or whatever, left
Dame Street, Occupy Dame Street,
Occupy Dame Street, right? Like, why has it not suffered that exact same fate? Like, is it the structure of Irish government? Is it the fact that those people are still, even though we've talked about this, and this might even tie back to the whole observation about, exporting, smart labor to other countries from Ireland going back a century. But is it that that valve, it just, there's no state relation for that valve to glom onto anyway? Like, what's going on there?
My first reaction to your question is, my God, someone should write a book about that, because I mean, dynamite question. I mean, you're in a sense, you're asking what potentially is and I guess we won't know for another couple of years whether, how profoundly important the question is, but it seems, based on the current trajectory, that it is in fact the question if you're someone part of the global left interested in questions of socialist strategy, right? And my real surprise here that Ireland, I'm speaking to you, I suppose, thinking of you as an American person on the left, interest in this question, and aware that people like yourself and others may be really kind of turning to Ireland as a kind of a case study. It messes with my head a little bit, because when you think about other countries that have served in this role as being kind of like these lightning rod examples for the left, these rallying points, as it were, where we can all kind of get behind, the Chilean elections we can get behind.
You're making me think this might be bad for Ireland if we think that.
No, but you read my mind, right? So I'm thinking like, in that horrible cliched sense, like sometimes success for the left is sometimes, well, almost universally success for the left hitherto has been somewhat disappointing, right? It's tended to fall short, and which invites a question or conversation about what counts for us as success. It will either go the kind of compromise route, then try to do something like some Sweden before 1973 that takes it right to the cusp of causing a capital strike and then pulls back again, or it will try to do something more like a Latin American style move. I think in the Irish context, it's much more likely to be Sweden than it is Venezuela. And so, we have to be ready to be disappointed a little bit here. I mean,
and also, to be fair, you don't really have the commodity base that Venezuela has, so you probably couldn't do it anyway.
That's a very good point. You're quite right. If I'd been thinking properly, I probably would have copped onto that a little bit sooner. So thank you for that. But but my point here is I'm simply thinking about some older kind of stuff that maybe we would have read from someone like Ben Burgess or Adam Proctor years ago when, at the height of the Bernie wave, they were, I think, intelligently raising the question, are we ready for power? It's not enough just simply to get your guys elected. That party that they constitute has to have capacities to govern. It has to know how to wield the state. They queue up here a lot of argumentation from the likes of Leo Panich and others who, have theorized from a Marxist perspective the question of the state. And so you get into state theory, you get into the Miliband versus Poulantzas debate, and you have to start parsing in a very careful way your expectations. If you're going the electoral route, which is what Sinn Fain ultimately will be doing, you will not achieve your utopia overnight. It will be half a step forward, 2 steps back, and a few steps sideways, and you're really up against a very difficult set of limitations that are inherent in the strategic approach. In some of my writing, Derek, I've talked about the comparison between the Greek left in the context of its Oki referendum and the Irish left in the context of the water protests of 2014. And one of the things I was trying to sort of argue there that came out of the Greek crisis was a profound sense that, for better or for worse, when Yanis Varoufakis and Alex Tsipras had their moment in the sun, if nothing else, they did have a set of parallel economies in Greece that they would be able to kind of turn to, as Leo Panich was arguing at the time, mobilize the military to sort of help them, build this sort of parallel economy that can maybe survive an EU siege, an EU orchestrated capital strike, adopt a kind of a state theory terroristic strategy, right? It has limitations, of course, but and of course it never really got tested because, as we know, Tsipras bottled at the last minute, much to the criticism of people like Varoufakis. I bring this up just, if I may, and
Go ahead.
I'm perfectly happy if you have objections, by the way, because these are speculative thoughts, but Ireland doesn't even have that. Like there isn't even a parallel economy in Ireland. So this project of like the sort of what some people in the literature call left-wing convergence, the kind of convergence between the kind of syndicalist, anarchic syndicalist, parallel economy approach and the long march through the state approach, the hegemonic, parliamentary hegemonic approach. If these two strategies within the European context are merging, they can only do so where there's an actual institutional possibility for doing so. You can't just wish it out of thin air, and it doesn't exist in Ireland, to be clear. So that already right there does suggest that a Sinn Fain party in office is going to have only the most limited ability to put its hand on the tiller, number one. And number two, strategically may, in fact, have only really one play, which is to wait for a constellation of other European countries to move left at the same time and band with them to become a counter-hegemonic bloc in the European Union. But these things have a terrible habit, Derek, of not showing up at the same time.
Right. It seems
Greece
like actually
was
this
2015. We're doing it now. We needed it all at the same moment. It's not the waves are not lined up, despite what a Hart and Negri or Paul Mason might argue. It doesn't really work in these kinds of. Sometimes, of course, but it doesn't always work in these kind of cycles that leftist historians sometimes refer to.
Well, there's.
Sorry, I spoke a lot there. I
really appreciate this because this is crucial, and it gives me a time to make a mea culpa about some stuff I said 10 years ago about Greece that I was right about. Okay. But so my argument against Syriza in 2013 was that they had come up with an economic policy for what they wanted to do, and it was a monetary policy, but they had not come up with an industrial base for that policy. The only person really talking about that was Leo Panitch. Everybody else, including most of the Syriza people, were banking this purely on maybe some kind of internal drachma stimulating
the Lapavitsas kind of model of Grexit, right? Yeah,
right. Which I was just like, this is ridiculous because you are going to need to purchase all kinds of stuff to build up your industrial base. You do have one in Greece. But it's not been utilized. And without utilizing, basically converting military capacity, like we were just saying, into like a parallel economy, this wasn't going to be happen. And almost nobody, I got the hint, and I love to hate on Varoufakis. People know that. I've
heard you. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, you've heard me go off of Varoufakis. I had a friend from Greece who's like, well, you're blaming the wrong person, and I was like, well, he should have known his allies were shitty. But
okay, I remember you said that. I'll quote you on that in the future.
But also, I think he was too into a very early manifestation of modern monetary theory that I think was going to run up into some real problems. But he did seem to hint at some of the stuff you were talking about, some of the stuff applied by Leo Panitch when he was still alive. And I interviewed Leo around the same time, so I heard a lot of this. One of the things that I would say that I want to make the mea culpa on, though, I was like, well, the problem is if you don't build up that internal economy, the Europeans are going to punish you so bad that you might as well have stayed. Here's where I was wrong. The Europeans punish them so bad any fucking way that it really doesn't matter.
Even though they completely capitulated.
Right. They still, they have benefited. Greece has benefited none from any of the economic improvements of the last 10 years. Not a whit. And
retrospectively, then, does that give you some sympathy for Lapavitsas in the end, or
it gives me some sympathy with Lapavitsas, and even though I think the monetary schema was foolish, but I think they would have run up against the reality of building up of having to transfer their military capacity into an industrial base anyway.
Of course, yeah.
And they probably could have leveraged the U.S. or China, or even played them both off of each other to get okay deals for cheap materials. Because, you know, while people forget this, because basically militarily Europe's kind of our bitch. It is still
That's a great
true.
point, Derek. I mean, whatever chances there was of this working in 2014, 2013, that sort of moment, now with the war going
it's
on,
over. It's no way.
you know, and the emerging multipolarity and the sense of geopolitical stakes around, say, hypothetical here, Greece moving closer to using Chinese capital or leveraging Chinese capital to do some of the things you're talking about. You could just imagine the antics that would be deployed.
I mean, it might even be a military situation where it would not have been in 2013, even if they were playing both sides off of each other. It would have been like, okay, whatever, Syriza's Nasser, we can deal with that. You know,
Yeah.
it's an interesting hypothetical. My feeling at the time, I guess, I've always thought that the EU, I mean, my friend and comrade Deep State Cuba is always telling me I'm too hard on the EU, but Greece is always my Greece is always my example of like where I'm like, no, like they didn't just capitulate them. They have punished them for a decade for no reason other than to make sure Portugal and Italy and maybe Ireland and any of the Baltic states never get any wild ideas. Like, and that's pretty clear to me that Greece was used as a global example by the EU, and you can't even blame that on like Western hegemony, because the US doesn't care.
Yeah.
Like that's one of the things where it's like the nature of the EU here that cannot be blamed on the US. That is EU internal politics, and it shows you what it really is. So when people like get all weepy about the EU, like a friend of the show, Steve Paxton, kind of scolded me for being too hard on the EU, and I was just like, I'm not taking any of it down. I saw what they did to Greece. Don't give me that. Like you know. It's just,
hey, when the IMF is writing papers and publishing papers about why you're being too harsh,
your austerity regime is too mean for the IMF and the World Bank. Like,
there's a problem when the U.S. Treasury is telling you might be overdoing it. You know, when the so-called ordoliberals are being flagged as being even more into austerity than the neoliberals, yeah, something's up, right? It's
yeah, and this is my so my Greek friends. I still think I was right about the over-reliance on monetary theory, but maybe you should have done it anyway. Like,
all right.
Because I underestimated how I let the Europeans convince me that they would not be that cruel, and I was wrong. So, like, I will not trust Europe again. But
well, it's hard to trust them now. I mean, when you have you know, Angela Merkel saying things like, "Oh yeah, Minsk 2, we weren't serious about that. That was just a facade to allow us to prepare Ukraine more for NATO accession, whatever." You know, you're just like, what's wrong with you people?
Yeah, that was the thing. I actually remember thinking that, and I was like,
they do lie, Derek.
I mean,
they do lie.
I remember reading about Yanukovych at the time, and going like, why? Like, people go, oh, it's all the U.S. I'm like, yeah, the U.S. has its own shenanigans. Don't get, I get it with NATO.
Oh,
but
sure.
Like, but
Nord
like,
Stream 2. Yeah.
Right. But like, but on the actual botching of the possibility of like,
I think that's right. Yeah.
I blame Merkel. Like, I'm like almost Merkel as a person. Like, it was it was just like, and then in like 2016, when she became a weird darling of like the center left in America, I was like, what are you on? I mean, like, that because she kind of made a concession to refugee policy. However, without really building the infrastructure in Germany for either the refugee sakes or for the sake of Germans being able to deal with the integration. So of course it led to a xenophobic backlash, which is totally predictable. It didn't have to be that way. They could have accepted the refugees under different conditions. They didn't do it. So and then they shamed everyone else, which of course made the people to the right of her look good. And American liberals are like, blah, 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 blah. It was maddening to understand anything about European politics and know that. And I also think the idea that, while I will say, yes, NATO, the boss of NATO is the United States. And yes, it is part of U.S. imperial policy. The idea that this is just a U.S. project is a way to deflect blame from the European project, and so that they can have their cake and eat it too on these shenanigans. And I mean, like, I can't prove that it's a speculative thing. We're talking about motives here, but it really does seem to me that, like, whenever something bad happens, it's like, well, the U.S. is the one really responsible for that. I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, from the standpoint of an American, we should say that. As an American leftist, I should say that because ultimately we're the most powerful in the room. But a European should not say that. A European should be looking at their own power structures. And when you use us as an excuse for what you do, it leads me to think that, like, even if we weren't here, you probably up to similar shenanigans. See also Macron in Africa right now. And so I do not have a lot of hope. I wish I did. I wish I could say that I'm saying we're going to have Shin Fain as a model. We're going to feel good. Luckily, Nicholas, I think we can say safely that right now the U.S. left hasn't picked up on Sinn Fain as a model for its problems, because otherwise there'd be 50 Jacobin editorials about this. But like there was about Boric in Chile just a few months ago. Before
I remember. That's actually, I'm glad you mentioned his name because I was reaching for that earlier on. Yeah.
It's just how bad they fucked up, and you're like it's
with the plebiscite. You mean
and their whole reading of their own internal politics, and then they're back away from that. Yeah.
The constitutional referendum that they were.
The constitutional referendum, which like has apparently like set the Chilean left back like almost to coup standards. I mean, it's bad. So
this is what happens when you believe when when you invest a little bit too much in the idea that the way people describe you is the way you are, and so when people said that the pink tide in South America was, captured perfectly by Leclauenmuth, and then you're like, okay, great, there's my playbook. I'm going to actually run with this now, and then you find out, oops, that's maybe not what actually I was this whole time, and that was a mistake.
Yeah, and I think
Essex, right? Because a lot of these Venezuelan types, Bolivian movement types, and Chilean, didn't they? Am I wrong here? I think some of them have more than a dash of exposure to.
Oh no, explicitly. I think Venezuela. Sussex. Yeah, to Sussex and to Leclauenmuth. I think that's not true for Venezuela as much. That's a mixture of like. Latin American Cadillo.
I'm just thinking like the Podemos guys in Spain did kind of steep themselves in a lot of South American stuff, if I'm not.
Yeah, absolutely they did. You're not wrong about that. Yeah. And this is this Marrow World reflection where like you get European theories from the 90s, which we were all hip on. I've talked about this in a couple of places recently. I remember buying Hart and Nagiri at my freshman year of college because it was on the New York Times fucking bestseller list when I was 19 years old, which is insane. Like the more I think about that, it's like that was insane.
Yeah.
That book is like, how did that book of all things end up on a New York Times bestseller list? At the same time, all the movement politics that inspired not only failed. I mean, we could talk about like the new left failing in the West and particularly in like France and America, but like that was actually more tangible than the than the 90s left failing. And then this movement back into social democratic politics in what used to be like a mixture of anarcho-syndicalist and Euro-communist world, really has also washed up on the beaches of history. Partly, some of it is timing, like you said. Some of it is like, well, if Shin Fain and Podemos and Syriza and maybe even Bernie have popped off at the same time,
well,
like it
might
might
be
have been a
somewhat
different
different
world.
outcome. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
But like, because these places would have had other counter hegemonic blocks to side up with, that there'd have been also like the development of something like a coherent left-wing geopolicy, which just does not exist. Like,
which, you know, with a fight that I get into sometimes with some of the more sort of left Brexit type people that I relate to sometimes in my academic profession. They exist. You know, they will often make this challenge, you know, that what you need is to sort of accentuate and focus on the democratic question before the left question, right? Like that, you know, the left has abandoned the British working class already, so we need, you know, just like a working class democratic movement, as it were, which I find to be kind of like a hollow point to some extent, but I think I sort of respect it from afar as a kind of an understandable, or, you know, I have empathy, put it that way, for it, even if I don't agree with it. I think I understand where it's coming from. I don't know if that's speaking quite to your point. Please go back to what you were saying, because I've lost my train of consciousness and I want to.
I mean, we're going big picture today, so why not?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't any Irish listeners out there, and I know there's at least two of you because you yell at me when I mispronounce things. Which, by the way, you're not special. I mispronounce everything, but even in languages I actually speak. So one of the things that I would say about the situation in Ireland is, to Irish people, is like, our complaints about this should not be taken as a reason not to try. Like, so I just want to like put that out there. We're not condemning you. We Sinn Fain's like an actual organic political movement. No one here is contesting that. It's just, I think we are gonna if you come into power, my Irish listeners, and assuming you are Sinn Fain fans, even, you're gonna have to deal with this. Now, for everybody else, okay, quit investing in people as tokens of hope in your own politics is not having a coherent geopolitical strategy. Like, talking about how great AMLO is, even if he's great, which I have a very mixed opinion of AMLO, but he's not bad. Are talking about Boric back in the day, or Syriza, or Podemos, which no one would shut up about a decade ago, almost exactly. If you do not actually understand the situation, and if you cannot support them, and a lot of times we can't, we're not in a position to, then overly identifying with these kinds of movements will end up with egg on your face, and you learn nothing for your own politics. Like I don't know that anybody in the US really learned anything by what happened from Syriza, because our context is so different anyway. But like, it just seems like any lessons of the actual politics of what happened to Syriza has been lost. I think that was true multiple times with the multiple pink waves and tides, which I've always been somewhat skeptical of. I've never been like oppositional to them. Also, it doesn't matter if I'm oppositional to them. I have no political power. People can just decide how they relate to me. Maybe somebody who has the ear of someone important could do something, but like, come on,
right?
I don't bomb anyone. So like, but
yet
in England, no. The thing that I think about when we think about this is that we as outsiders to Irish politics or to whatever politics should be supportive of this, but we should not cheerlead any of it, because one, we will wear egg on our face to anyone who listens to this, both domestically for that politics and on our own for anyone who follows it. And two, and we have no control over it, so it's a real dumb thing to do. And two, I don't know that it helps anyone. I don't know that it's going to help any member of Sinn Fain if they became the next, darling of Jacobin and Nation articles. Like, I just, maybe they could get some funding. I don't know. I doubt it.
Well, there's something there's something to it, right? I mean, like, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have a next generation of young people exposed to a sense of possibility and on this kind of stuff. I mean, I'm always a little bit romantic about stuff like that. I know can be naive, I know, but
you should push back against my cynicism. But I think the last point I want to get to is how can we actually, though, if we were to say, what should the left's question should not be, should we cheerlead or condemn this? The left question could be, if any left-wing faction, even in the Democratic Party, got power, what would we do as trade policy to support Sinn Fain? Like, that's a realistic thing. We don't have that power. It's totally hypothetical at this point, but it seems to me like a much more useful imaginary than just being like, yay, go Irish left. We can do that here. Because the other thing is, the context of Ireland, as I think I've been trying to point out, is both like enough to the US that it can feel superficially the same, but when you actually look at it, it's dramatically different, even for the reasons why it is superficially the same.
No, I think that's a really good point. When I had lost my train of consciousness earlier on, and I kind of remembered the thing that I was trying to get to, which is this idea that, one of the arguments people like me have used, one of the arguments just to be very clear that this is, on me here, my hands are dirty with this. One of the arguments I have used in the past is, that the European left needs to get serious about constituting itself as a European left. It needs to become a polity. It needs to be a polity. And as I was saying, I was kind of almost at the point, and then it disappeared out of my head earlier on. But the one of the things that the sort of the pro-Brexit crowd tend to do, and I think it's a weakness in their argument necessarily, is they say that there is no hope for a European left because there is no such thing as a European polity. There's no European political community to go with the institutions that constitute the European, capital E, capital C, European community. And they're, of course, mostly right. But what I always think about is the fact that the nation isn't exactly a naturally existing polity either. I mean,
no.
And if you're British, claiming that there's no European polity in the present moment, given your I think well taken remarks earlier on about what's happening in the UK being kind of a disaster right now. I mean, it's small comfort to think that oh goody, the British polity got its autonomy back or something like this. It hasn't exactly been a great experience.
I mean, if you want to see one of the heads of empire become Argentina
in a fast,
in effectively 3 years, from my Schadenfreude standpoint, then I guess it's fun. But from a standpoint of an actually developed European left, of which even I think an actually developed North American left, which is where I think our internationalism needs to be aimed over.
So if that's the big card you're playing in your pack, that there's no such thing as a European polity, I mean, okay, I agree with you. Empirically, it's got a ways to go, but I'm not particularly impressed by the track record of trying to play the do you want to fight the motherfuckers? Excuse my language. In your state, or do you want to fight them at some kind of European federal level? I'm not sure you're going to have much difference in your luck, whichever path you choose. There's pros and cons to both. And that really just is kind of like a way of sort of drawing a line under the Sinn Fain question, because of course, I don't want, there's nobody in our conversation tonight that's here to defend the Brexit perspective. And again, I have complicated feelings about Brexit. I'm not an anti-Brexit person. I have these kinds of questions for both sides, as it were. And one of my questions for the pro-Brexit left was, okay, well, good luck with your polity then, because one of the things that they seem to say is that, I've seen one of the members of the Alpha Bunga podcast make this point in writing. It's I forget which one of them it was now, but
probably Philip, if I was.
I think it was George, actually, to be honest. But he said something at the end of one of his chapters in an edited volume. He said that the repudiation of the nation is always an elitist project, and I'm just like, get the fuck out. Do you know what I mean?
That's literally an inversion of one. I mean, yes, I will admit there is a certain appeal to nationalism amongst the working class that cannot be denied.
And I like George. I should
right.
I want to be clear. He's a friend. I don't. But
I know, and again, I appreciate your humbleness, Nicholas.
Humility.
Your humility. I actually do see it as a virtue. It's just a virtue that I lack.
Okay.
So,
I wouldn't say that, Dubin. You're a good guy.
I have many virtues, but humility is not generally one of them. One of the things that I would say to that, I mean, other than the fact that, like, yes, there is a certain amount of, like, internationalism, ironically, does historically for Marxism require nationalism as a modernizing project. But the point is for nationalism to go away, even in that scenario. So to say that, like, the Marxist project is to repudiate nationalism as always elitist just seems to me like a wild overclaim. The way we tend to do it, the way we tend to favor a kind of developmental cosmopolitanism, totally, yes, absolutely, an elitist project.
I agree.
But
well said. Yeah.
But I'm not giving up international. I got no interest in American nationalism, my friends. I just don't care. So, like,
me neither.
Like, unless you're thinking I should, like, organically go back to being a partisan for my state, the great state of Georgia, which, normally I just trust those people. They tend to be neo-Confederates. Just normally not a great idea. It is not something that really appeals to me. Now, maybe it's my lack of an organic rootedness to anything, but it is something that I find. I tend to be skeptical of nationalism because I do think the one thing that you have to remember is capital, even if it's different country to country, is an international project necessarily, and it has been from moment one.
That's so true.
And nations, particularly small little island ones, don't stand that much of a chance. And that's something that I think, like, I mean, when you think about, okay, the USSR,
I will tell you, sorry, just to interrupt real quick. I mean, this is where I actually do maybe have an opinion which is not settled or cast in concrete just yet, but it's I do kind of in this moment think about Bernie Sanders' claim that the open borders movement is a Koch brothers conspiracy, and I understand that there's a kind of a left-wing sort of position there, but when it comes to something that's already been underway for several decades now, like the European Union, which obviously is an internally, open or relatively open emerging federal system, for want of a better term, the ship sailed. And if you're a small country like Ireland, to borrow your phrase from just a moment ago, and you're a left-wing political party about to take power in that context, you know, I'm not really seeing an ire exit, if that's a neologism that will be permitted. An ire exit movement is not in the offing. It's not something Irish people want. I don't know if I'm.
And it would probably be economically disastrous for the reasons of not even having the ability to do what Greece didn't do.
Precisely.
Like,
yes.
That's
the punchline. That's the punchline.
Like,
so again, that's just why I was saying, just for listeners who may be like, you know, is this guy being too flip or whatever? I think that's why earlier on I was talking about the importance of this question of synchronization and the difficulty of it, and just to be kind of quite realistic that Sinn Féin's hands will be tied on a number of things. I mean, they have, in the European Union context, major constraints on what they can do as part of the Eurozone in terms of fiscal expansion.
No monetary sovereignty.
Monetary autonomy is very difficult. Debt ratios are tightly controlled. And so this idea of, you know, now there's land held by the state which could be parceled off. There's definitely there's ways they can get their hands on some cash internally, but it won't really move the needle in terms of the expense of what we're talking about here, which are, you know, very high tech, environmentally friendly, you know, eco efficient dwellings for modern families. It's going to be tough.
Yeah, and I suppose, Nicholas, sometimes I think we should burn the EU down, but I have always thought that you need a Republic of Nations to replace it, like, or you need to change it internally. Those are your options.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, like, Germany. I just make me think, if England, you know, 300 years of the world's greatest island nation power that the world ever knew is reduced to not to offend my Argentinian friends, but is reduced to Argentina in 3 years, you know, a Brexit.
Yeah.
Then because its ability to leverage its trade imbalances to hide its deindustrialization completely goes away, and it can't be the money laundering capital of the world anymore. What chance does any of the European nations have, except for maybe France and Germany? And even that seems questionable. So, and I think, you know, for us in North America, I mean, yes, we are bigger polities. Like, you know, like, I always remind myself that, like, most of the UK fits in Alabama. Like, you know, just to remind myself of the difference in scale we're talking about here. But I
think you can put 15 Irelands in Texas. I'm not sure, but I think it's 13 or 15. I can't remember.
It's my other thing when people compare.
I figured that out one day. I sort of sat down and like calculated the area. It's
when
kind
people
of striking.
compare to Nordic countries, and I'm like, you do realize that, like, I don't know, a Nordic country has like 1/100th of the population of the U.S. and
relatively speaking, a lot more oil.
Right.
If you're Norway, right?
Right. I mean, per capita, for sure. I mean, even though U.S. is fairly energy secure, but yes.
Sovereign wealth funds are a great thing, though, not to be poo-pooed, you know?
No, agreed. That's the only reason Venezuela still exists. So, like, let's be honest. So these things are something that we have to think about. I think for us on the Atlantic side of the channel, just to like tie it in for a minute, why should we care? Because I've already said, like, don't turn Sinn Fain into your next Podemos. Like, that's not going to go well for Sinn Fain, and it's not going to go well for you. But I do think we have to start asking ourselves some serious questions about how we align. If for some wild hair that we ever broke out of our current rut and actually, I don't know, formed a Labor Party, did the dirty break, did a clean break, like, took over the government by military coup. I don't know, like, good luck on that, since leftists are allergic to the military. But nonetheless, I mean, if any of those things happened, which I will admit the chances are not zero, but not far from it. What would we do to be supportive and also not ruin the autonomy of these other left-wing movements and states? Because the other thing that you like, let's say you did have a left movement take over in America, we would have to be incredibly careful, not because of America's imperial history, not to delegitimize anything we help. So that's a bind that we should be thinking about in relations to these sorts of movements, in a more serious way. Yes, it's a hypothetical. It's a total hypothetical, but it seems to be like, one of the things that I've told people about multipolarity. I was like, multipolarity is like rain. It's happening. It's going to happen. It's like El Nino. It's a thing. It changes the way stuff works. In and of itself, I have apparently the unpopular opinion of thinking it's neutral, that it's neither good nor bad. It's just a thing. And that we really have to think about how we enter this phase of multipolarity without encouraging war and economic devastation in other areas. And that the left, instead of merely celebrating or condemning it, which is like, again, celebrating or condemning rain, in my opinion, we have to think about how we orient towards this now. Because the one thing I will tell you is the U.S. as a regional hegemonic power is not going away for sheer geography. Like, that is something that we have to deal with, whether we like it or not. I mean, maybe something else replaces it. Maybe this current constitutional government's dead. I don't know. We're talking real hypotheticals here. But some kind of very, like, the likelihood of a fairly strong power emerging out of this geographic alignment is actually pretty good. So you have to think about that when you orient towards the rest of the planet. And there's two ways to do it. You can either be helpful, or you can be an imperialist shitbag. Those are, I mean, like, I guess you can also stay out of it, but there's almost no way that in a multipolar world that a strong power won't be caught up in regional games and other hegemonic blocks. Which
That's right. It's going to be a lot harder for us, I think, now, with the geostrategic pressure kind of now. Look, I mean, it's so interesting to think about. I was just talking to this with my students the other day, and might be an interesting way for us to begin to wrap up the show. I don't know, but when you think about the absolute meltdown that DC is having right now over the revelations in the new Elon Musk book, the biography written by Walter Isaacson, on the fact that he would not, at the drop of a pin, turn on Starlink over the Crimea Peninsula. This is coming out in the book now. It's Elon Musk corroborated it the other day. So this is just a story that's really emerging in the last few days. So people are basically saying now that this is outrageous. The Democrats are saying it's outrageous. Another reason to maybe depose Elon Musk, or perhaps even nationalize, SpaceX, for these sort of geostrategic reasons. Now, look, I think there's plenty of reasons to nationalize SpaceX, right? But I don't think I don't want it for the same reasons that they wanted it. And it's we're entering into an odd moment, Derek, I'm afraid. And the opportunities are going to narrow considerably, I fear, given that this war, and I've been guilty of this. I think for a while now I've been thinking, this is just a short war. This is a war that it's the Falklands. It's just a bigger version of the Falklands. It's a misunderstanding. more sober minds will prevail, and hell, even capitalist rationality will prevail and prevent the war from going on too much longer. Everyone wants a way out of this. Global capitalism is not enjoying this war. Maybe individual arms manufacturing entities might be, but on the whole, it hasn't been great for global finance. Whatever, it's broken the dollar hegemony. It's creating these parallel credit card systems. It's fragmenting things, and so capitalism doesn't want that. So rationality will prevail, but that doesn't seem to be happening, Derek. So it seems like we're having conversations in Capitol Hill now that I would have actually been really surprised to see even a year ago, 2 years ago, shall we say. Centrist Democrats talking about nationalizing SpaceX. It's just the priorities are shifting.
Yeah,
and you are going to be seeing great difficulty now for any European left-wing movements, I think, as a result of that, because you could easily see strategies of tension, reappearing in a European context.
Absolutely. And I also think the American left shouldn't underestimate this either, because which is not to say that I'm defending any January 6th cretins, but the use of RICO charges for that, in context with some other things I've been seeing happening since 2021 of civil RICO charges being launched on unions and whatnot. And we now see these really draconian, even more draconian than we saw in the 1950s stuff coming down on the Cop City protesters. Regardless of how you feel about all the Cop City stuff, there's parts of that I'm ambivalent about. But these RICO charges are terrifying, because they are potentially they're dragnets that you haven't even thought of. You gave to the DSA once, the DSA gave to this, and all of a sudden you're caught up in a RICO case. And that's going to both be an internal and external pressure. We've also seen the ability to paint an anti-war movement as largely right-wing, even if the anti-war movement does not speak in terms of unilateral concessions to Russia. I mean,
exactly.
I'm one of these people who thinks total war victories are not even possible in the modern era, except in very rare scenarios. And I'm just this is insane to me, that being no, we should start thinking about how would we orient it in a way also that both sides can save face, and you don't end up having an Afghanistan-like situation on the edge of Europe. That seems to be a disaster. One of my dystopian moments, and again, I like when listeners know that I do make mea culpas. I also there were two mistakes I made in the beginnings of the Ukraine war. One, I went with Mersheimer. I was there's no way they're going to go for Kiev. They're just going to do the smart thing and occupy the separatist republics, and you
feel they did go for Kiev.
I don't feel like they went for Kiev to take it. I don't think they were trying to even do regime change, but I do think they went to Kiev as a kind of establish a power base for negotiations of strength, and it just didn't work.
I know you had another point to make, but I mean, just food for thought maybe. But I mean, I think we can kind of do a post facto reconstruction of the motivations now that we know a little more about what was going on in those negotiations that Boris Johnson interrupted, because it seems that, in fact, what the Russians were initially kind of posturing for was the terms of a lease in the Crimea, basically, and they would have been very happy to accept that, knowing it. So, and maybe that's not chronologically correct, because of course, were the negotiations the original position, or were they positioned after the early part of the war hadn't gone well for them, and they felt, willing to compromise some other, who knows? Yeah, but I think I think it would have been close enough to their original position.
My assumptions is, even though this was a preemptive war and thus not under my doctrine of justifiable war, I will say that I've always assumed that the Russians were rational, that there was a rational reason for each step, and I just didn't see it.
And
Like,
that's something Mearsheimer would give you. Yeah.
right.
So what was your other mea culpa?
My other mea culpa is I thought the Ukrainians would realize that NATO had no interest in giving them exactly what they wanted, but had every interest in having them being a bleeding ground.
Yeah.
And that thus that they would be smart and realize maybe to negotiate before things got so bad that they would never be able to. But of
Yeah.
course, I was just way naive on that. My nightmare assumption that I did have early on, and it was my nightmare assumption, was that NATO's goal was to make this war so bad that whether or not Russia wins or loses, they still win as far as their strategic. The NATO, not the U.S. economy.
Like it's a scorched earth.
Yeah, it's
basket, and yeah,
but that's like, this is just going to be a problem for you forever now, whether you win or lose, and
blow up all the dams and the infrastructure, and yeah.
Any government that takes power, whether it's Russia supported or Western supported, is going to be illegitimate from here on out by one side or the other.
Yeah.
Like it's just going to be a problem. And so I was like, surely people realize that that's part of the goal here. And that the other thing it does is, even though you're right, it's led to de-dollarization, my unpopular opinion has also led to the acceleration of the yuan as a global currency before it was ready, and that's also not gone well. So
absolutely, yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
So it's like it's one of these things where you look at the balance and it's like, well, the U.S. has hurt, but it's also hurt Derek, everybody else.
I would just say that the thing about the yuan, though, is that those things don't happen on a course of natural evolution. And I don't disagree with you. It's just to sort of put it out there that, we've mentioned Leo Panitch already in this conversation once in a different context, but what he's most known for, I suppose, is his book with Sam Gindin on the making of global capitalism, where they do a very sort of intricate, detailed, blow by blow account of how the pudding was made. The state managerial intensity that was brought to bear on the project of making the US dollar the numeraire, not just in a sense of what they negotiated and hashed out at Bretton Woods, but in a sense of aligning institutional practices in central banks in Indonesia, South Korea, you name it, right? Like there was meticulous attention brought to bear. And so this is you were talking about this kind of a question of the evolution of the yuan. Like it's in some ways you're more right than and in some ways it points to this question of possibility and political will, and the idea that it's not inconceivable that this new multipolar entity would want to maybe do this work to produce this other currency, and it would take maybe a very long time, but it would take more than that. It would take political will and capital to do.
Absolutely.
So before it's ready, yes, you're right, but not that it couldn't be made more ready, and it will have to be made ready in the fight anyway. Like you don't just get to the US dollar did not just kind of arrive ready-made. It had to be. Look, the metaphor is kind of like electric cars, and you can't just like have one. You need to have charging points all over the place. You know what I mean? Like It's the same kind of idea. There has to be an infrastructure, and the US dollar had to create one.
Well,
and it was created.
It was created both by the U.S. and by the failure of Britain to maintain its empire. Which
I suppose that's a good point.
I mean, like, this is, there's a reason why, like, I don't know, MMT currency sovereignty perfectly aligns with the post-war Anglo-imperial world. I don't know, like, why that is not the reason why I'm skeptical about anyone. Like, I think we're going to see a massive reshuffling, but the idea of like China being able to replace and I'm not even sure they wanted to be completely frank. They did want an alternative system that would also somehow not be hostile to the U.S. system. And this is a vision that I get pushback on people for being too pro-Chinese for, which I think is funny because
interesting.
I'm generally kind of skeptical, but I really do think they wanted to do Keynesian internationalism of the Marshall Plan type without imperialism, which is really fucking hard. And this war has greatly complicated that, and so other strategies have had to merge. What we have over all of our heads is not only do we have the climate change problems, whatever they are, and I don't want to get into climate change apocalypticism because I don't think it's helpful, but even if it was true, I don't think it's helpful. I'm not sure I think it's true either. But one of the things that I would say about this is, even assuming the worst case scenario for climate change and that over our heads, we also have the fact that we live in a nuclear armed world where with the war capacity as such that no one knows how to unleash it, and that is both good and bad as far as like people's ability to pivot here.
You're right.
And the last thing, we also all the developed world has a demographic bomb, including China, that's about to go off. And
sounds ominous.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, it actually could be a good thing, but we live in a capitalist world, and so like stabilizing your growth pattern would be a disaster for capitalism, and so it's a bad thing. And we're also going to see a bunch of great, I think, from the equatorial places, great movements of people, and that's going to destabilize everybody.
Well, friends, it seems like we might have reached the end of the show if we're still alive. I've texted Derek, and we'll see if we can get him back. But I'm not seeing double checks on the message. So with that said, he was wrapping up. And Derek, if you're watching this in the production, you can maybe either edit this part out or get me back on and we'll record the ending. If not, I will take up the duties as podcast host on an ad hoc basis and say thank you for having me tonight. It was a great pleasure. Anybody who is interested in Irish politics, I would strongly suggest, for deeper investigations into some of the stuff, checking out the work of Daniel Finn, great scholar, Michael Taft, an American economist living in Dublin. He's a trade union economist. So he is worth checking out as well. And I want to say maybe a few other names as well of people who are worth following. On the Trotskyist left, you have people like Richard Boyd Barrett, who often has good things to say. There are, on the sort of academic side of the equation, you have people like Helena Sheehan, who recently retired, but who was actually on the ground present for a lot of the Occupy Dame Street protests. She is someone who's sort of done a couple of publicly available and quite meticulous essays on that sort of Occupy moment in Ireland and what went right, what went wrong. So worth checking out. And of course, anyone who's interested can reach out to me. I'm at Occupy IR Theory on Twitter. And thanks again to Derek for having me tonight. I will hopefully be able to join you guys again soon on a future episode. It was a great pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for listening.